My husband left for a business trip. Minute later, his phone rang under the couch. I'm waiting for you, honey. Hi, welcome to my channel. This is my new story.
I found a second phone hidden in my living room the morning my husband kissed me goodbye. One message, one letter B. I didn't argue, I audited. $47,000. Sliced into perfect pieces and funneled to a woman he swore didn't exist. Then a stranger called and shattered what was left. By Friday, I had everything, his lies, her plan, the baby. So I emptied his life out of my house and left one thing behind. When he came home, the truth was waiting for him. Thank you for being here more than you know. One quick question before we begin. Where in the world are you right now? Drop your city or country below. Let's see how far this story travels. This story includes fictionalized elements crafted for educational and storytelling purposes. Names and settings are coincidental, but what this story has to say is something worth hearing. Monday mornings in Belle Meade have a particular kind of quiet. Not the dead quiet of an empty house or the tense quiet of a bad marriage. The comfortable quiet of a life that has found its rhythm and stopped questioning it. I stood at the kitchen counter with my second cup of coffee, watching the light come through the window above the sink, the way it always did in July, gold and generous, laying itself across the hardwood floor in long, warm strips. Outside, the dogwood trees along the driveway held absolutely still. Not a breath of wind. Just another Monday in the kind of neighborhood where the lawns are always trimmed and the problems are always hidden behind freshly painted shutters. Our house sat at the end of a curved driveway on a street where the homes were spaced far enough apart that you never heard your neighbors unless they wanted you to. $890,000 of Nashville real estate, and it felt every bit of it, the high ceilings, the wide kitchen island, the master suite that Donovan and I had renovated 3 years ago, when we both agreed we deserved something nicer. We had been married for 14 years by then. We had earned the marble countertops. We said. We had earned all of it. That was the story I told myself, that we had built this life together, piece by careful piece, and that the foundation was solid because we had laid it ourselves. I heard Donovan before I saw him. The sound of his rolling suitcase on the upstairs hardwood, then the careful thump of it navigating the staircase. He appeared in the kitchen doorway looking the way he always looked on work mornings, pressed shirt, dark slacks. The kind of effortless presentation that came from 14 years of knowing exactly what worked. Donovan Calloway was a real estate developer who understood that appearances were part of the product. He dressed accordingly. "Coffee's fresh," I said. "No time." He set the suitcase by the back door and picked up his phone from the counter, face down the way it always was. I had noticed that habit years ago. The phone always placed face down when he sat at the kitchen table, always slipped into his pocket before I could glance at the screen. I had chalked it up to something I genuinely admired. A man who believed breakfast was for breakfast. A man who could disconnect. I had been wrong about what he was disconnecting from. He poured half a cup, drank it standing, and pulled up the Notes app on his phone to run through his schedule out loud. 4 days in Austin. A presentation to a group of commercial investors on a mixed-use development project his firm had been building toward for 18 months. The kind of deal that justified the early flights and the packed suitcase and the Sunday evening spent on the phone instead of the back porch. "The Henderson file is on the shared drive if Harwick needs anything," he said, referring to his boss, the CEO of the development firm where Donovan had worked his way up over the past decade. I already briefed him Friday. "I know," I said. "You told me Saturday." He smiled. "Right, sorry. This was us." Comfortable and coordinated the way long marriages become when they are functioning well. We did not need to fill every moment with conversation. We had learned the grammar of each other, the shorthand, the shortcuts, the comfortable silences that did not need explaining. I carried my coffee to the front window while he finished his checklist. Across the street, my neighbor Bartlett was already settled into his customary spot on the front porch, an old wooden rocker, a thermos of what I assumed was the same dark roast he had been drinking every morning for 30 years. Bartlett was a retired Nashville police detective who had lived on this street for longer than most of the current residents had owned their homes. He did not miss much. He waved when he caught me looking a single slow raise of one hand, and I waved back. I had always found his presence oddly reassuring. There was something grounding about a man who had spent his career paying attention to things other people overlooked. On quiet mornings, I liked knowing he was out there. Donovan appeared behind me with his jacket over one arm and his suitcase handle extended. I called the car service. They're pulling up in 3 minutes. Did you pack the charger this time? Front pocket of the carry-on. He set the jacket down on the arm of the sofa and pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than our weekday goodbyes usually did. When he kissed me, there was something deliberate about it, something that registered in the back of my mind as slightly different, though I could not have named it then. He kissed me like he was memorizing something. I thought it was sweet. I was wrong. The car arrived. I walked him to the door, watched him load the suitcase, watched the black sedan pull smoothly down the driveway and turn onto the street. Bartlett raised his thermos from across the way in a small salute. Donovan did not look back. I stood in the open doorway for a moment, finishing my coffee, listening to the neighborhood settle back into its Monday morning quiet. Then I went inside to straighten up. The living room first throw pillows back on the sofa, remote controls stacked on the coffee table, the throw blanket folded and draped over the armrest, the way I liked it. I picked up Donovan's jacket from where he had left it and turned toward the closet. That was when I saw it. Wedged between the far armrest and the sofa cushion, half buried under the decorative pillow Donovan had pushed aside when he sat down to put on his shoes. A phone. Small black. Slightly older model than the one he carried every day, the kind of device that would be easy to overlook in a busy morning. I might have assumed it was old and forgotten, might have set it on the counter to mention later, except that as I picked it up, the screen lit. One unread message. The preview visible without unlocking it. 4 words and a name. The name was just a letter, B. I stood there in my quiet living room in my $890,000 house in my 14-year marriage holding a phone that did not belong to the life I thought I was living. The coffee in my hand had gone completely cold. I did not sleep well on Monday night. I lay on my side of the bed, the left side same as always, the side closer to the window, and stared at the ceiling while the Nashville summer heat pressed against the glass outside and the air conditioning ran its steady, indifferent hum. The phone was on the nightstand. I had not opened it again after that first moment in the living room. I had simply carried it upstairs, set it down like it was something fragile, and spent the next several hours pretending to read a book whose words I could not retain. 14 years of marriage, and I never knew my husband owned a second phone. The question was not how he had hidden it. The question was why he needed to. By 7 the next morning, I was back in the kitchen with fresh coffee and the kind of tired clarity that only comes after a night of not quite sleeping. I picked up the phone from where I had left it and sat down at the kitchen island. The screen required a passcode, 4 digits. I tried the obvious ones, first our wedding anniversary, his birthday, the year we bought the house. Nothing worked. Then I tried the year he graduated college. The screen unlocked. Some people hide things carelessly. They use the same passwords they have always used because changing them requires admitting even to themselves that there is something worth hiding. The message thread at the top was from a contact saved only as B. No last name, no photo, no other identifying information. The message that had come through yesterday morning was brief, warm in the way that implied a long history of warmth. Not the language of a business contact, not the language of a friend. Below it, where the rest of the conversation should have been, there was nothing. The history had been wiped clean, not just archived, deleted. Someone had taken the time to remove every previous message, every photo, every voice memo. What remained was a single incoming text and a phone number with a Nashville area code. I sat with that for a long moment. In my line of work, absence of information is itself a kind of information. When a financial record has been scrubbed, when transactions disappear from a ledger, when someone has taken deliberate care to remove a trail, that effort tells you something. It tells you the trail was worth hiding. I wrote the number down on the notepad I kept by the fruit bowl. Then I set the phone face up on the counter and opened my laptop. Marlo picked up on the second ring of the video call already at her desk, with her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a coffee mug the size of a small bucket in her hand. Marlo had been my closest colleague for 7 years, a senior forensic accountant at the same firm where I worked, the kind of person who approached every problem with the same steady, unsentimental precision. She was also one of the few people I trusted completely. "You look terrible," she said, which was her version of asking if I was okay. "I found something," I said. I walked her through it methodically, the suitcase goodbye that ran too long, the 4-day Austin trip, the phone behind the sofa cushion, the passcode that turned out to be his graduation year, the deleted messages and the single remaining text from someone saved only as B. Marlo listened without interrupting, which was not her default setting. When I finished, she set down her coffee mug and was quiet for a moment in a way that told me she was thinking rather than hesitating. "Okay," she said finally. "Before you do anything else, when is the last time you actually looked at your joint account statements? Not glanced at them. Looked." The question landed in a specific way. Marlo did not ask things without reason. "Donovan handles the household accounts," I said. "He has since we combined finances." I paused. "That was 12 years ago." "I know," she said. "Look at them now." We stayed on the call while I opened the banking portal. Donovan and I maintained a joint checking account that covered the mortgage, utilities, household expenses, and a joint savings account we had been building toward an eventual property investment of our own. I knew the approximate balances. I reviewed the mortgage statements when they came. I had never had reason to audit my own marriage. The checking account looked normal enough at first: regular deposits, predictable outflows, but the savings account stopped me. The balance was $47,000 lower than it should have been. I pulled up the transaction history and felt something shift in my chest, not panic, but the cold, focused attention that takes over when a set of numbers stops making sense. The money had not disappeared in a single withdrawal. It had left in pieces transfers ranging from $800 to $4,500 spread across the past 3 months in no obvious pattern. Some on weekdays, some on weekends, some in the middle of the month, some clustered near the end. No two transfers exactly alike in amount or timing. I knew this pattern. I had testified about it in a federal courtroom 18 months ago. It was a technique I had spent my career exposing in other people's finances. Now I was looking at it in my own. I stared at the screen and let the full weight of that settle. "Serena." Marlo's voice came through the laptop speaker. "What are you seeing?" $47,000, I said, gone in pieces small enough to avoid attention. She did not say anything for a moment. Neither did I. I closed the banking portal. I closed the laptop. I picked up my work bag from the hook by the back door, found my keys, and stood in the kitchen for exactly 30 seconds looking at the room around me. The marble countertops we said we had earned the hardwood floor with its gold stripes of July light. The notepad by the fruit bowl with a Nashville phone number written in my own handwriting. Then I walked out to my car. Because if someone had been moving money out of my life in calculated pieces, I knew exactly how to find out where it had gone. Finding financial truth was not something I did occasionally or carefully. It was what I did every single day, and I was very good at it. The conference room on the 14th floor of our Midtown Nashville office had floor-to-ceiling windows that faced west, which meant that on Tuesday afternoons the light came in at an angle that made spreadsheets difficult to read, and people looked more tired than they actually were. I had spent enough late afternoons in that room to know to pull the shades halfway. Marlo had already done it by the time I walked in with my laptop and the notepad from my kitchen counter. She had cleared the table and set up her own workstation at the far end, 2 monitors, a legal pad, and the focused expression she wore when a case had stopped being routine. She looked up when I came in and did not say anything, which meant she had already been thinking about it all morning and was ready to work. We did not need to restate the problem. We both understood what we were looking for. I pulled up the joint savings account transaction history and exported it into a clean spreadsheet. 31 separate transfers over a 94-day period. Marlo took the first half. I took the second, and for the next 2 hours the room was quiet, except for the occasional click of a keyboard and the sound of Nashville traffic 12 floors below. The pattern became clear within the first 20 minutes. No single transfer exceeded $4,500, most clustered between $800 and $2,200. The timing varied, some on Tuesday mornings, some on Friday afternoons, a few scattered across midweek with no obvious schedule. The amounts never repeated exactly. Someone had taken care to ensure that no two transactions looked alike. This was not carelessness. This was methodology. In forensic accounting, we call it structuring the deliberate practice of breaking large sums into smaller transactions designed to stay beneath the thresholds that trigger automatic regulatory attention. Under the Bank Secrecy Act, banks are legally required to file a currency transaction report for any cash transaction exceeding $10,000. Structured transactions varied in amount and timing. Always kept safely below that ceiling are a well-documented technique for moving money while avoiding that scrutiny. It is also a federal offense when done with the intent to evade reporting requirements, which is a detail I had explained to juries on 3 separate occasions. Whoever had engineered these transfers understood how financial oversight worked. They had not stumbled into this pattern by accident. He knew what he was doing, Marlo said, not looking up from her screen. It was not a question. He knew exactly what he was doing, I said. The transfers all originated from the same joint savings account. They all landed in the same destination, a business account registered to a company I had never heard Donovan mention. The company name was clean and professional sounding, the kind of name designed to be forgettable. BW Design Consulting, LLC. Marlo opened a new tab and navigated to the Tennessee Secretary of State's online business registry, a publicly accessible database where any Tennessee registered business entity can be looked up by name. Registered agent or owner. It is the kind of resource that most people do not know exists until they need it. In our line of work, we used it regularly. She typed in the company name and hit enter. The filing came up immediately. BW Design Consulting, LLC, registered in Tennessee 14 months ago. Single-member limited liability company, which meant one person owned it entirely. The registered agent information was listed along with the name of the sole member. The name on the screen was Blythe Weston. Marlo typed the name into Google without pausing the way you do when you are working a case, and a name is just the next data point in a sequence. The LinkedIn profile appeared near the top of the results. She clicked it. The page loaded. Professional headshot, a woman somewhere in her mid-30s, blonde hair, the kind of self-possessed expression that came from being comfortable in front of a camera. Her title was listed as principal architect. Her firm operated out of the Gulch, a neighborhood in Nashville known for its upscale mixed-use development and the kind of independent creative studios that catered to high-end commercial clients. The kind of clients, for instance, who developed commercial real estate. Marlo leaned back in her chair and looked at me. I was looking at the screen. The profile listed several featured projects, renovations, commercial interiors, one notable mixed-use building in East Nashville. There were endorsements from other professionals in the development industry. There were shared posts about architectural design trends and urban planning and sustainable building materials. There was nothing on the profile that looked unusual, nothing that looked like anything other than a successful independent architect building a legitimate career in Nashville. And yet, 14 months ago, someone named Blythe Weston had opened a single-member LLC in Tennessee. Over the past 3 months, $47,000 from my joint savings account had been transferred to that LLC in 31 carefully structured transactions. And the man who made those transfers was currently in a city he had told me he needed to be in for a work presentation that, for all I knew at this moment, may or may not have been real. I looked at the profile photo for a moment, then I closed the laptop. I have a name, I said. You have more than a name, Marlo said quietly. She was right. I had a name, a face, and a business entity. I had 14 years of marriage on one side of the scale and $47,000 missing dollars on the other. I had a pattern of transfers that any federal prosecutor would recognize on sight, moving from my household account into a company registered to a woman whose professional world overlapped neatly with my husband's. The numbers, as they always did, had told the truth. What they had not yet told me was the full shape of it. How deep it went. how long it had been going, and exactly what Donovan had been building while I was busy finding other people's financial lies. That part would come next. I picked up my notepad, uncapped my pen, and wrote Blythe Weston's name at the top of a fresh page. Then I drew a line underneath it and started a new column. I did not go to Bartlett immediately. Tuesday night, I sat at the kitchen island with a glass of water I did not drink and thought about the name written at the top of my notepad. Blythe Weston. I thought about the LLC registered 14 months ago, about the 31 transfers, about the profile photo of a woman with blonde hair and a confident smile whose studio happened to be 12 minutes from my front door. I thought about all of it in the methodical way I think about everything, turning it over and examining each side before drawing a conclusion. And somewhere in the middle of that quiet Tuesday night, I remembered the white SUV. It had been parked in our driveway twice last spring, maybe 3 times. I had noticed it the way you notice a car that does not belong to anyone you know and then immediately file it under Not Your Business. A newer model, white Tennessee plates. I had assumed it belonged to one of Donovan's site contacts, someone stopping by to drop off documents or walk through a detail on a project. Donovan had mentioned something once about a designer coming to look at the house for reference photos. I had not asked follow-up questions because it had not occurred to me to ask. By Wednesday morning, I had 2 cups of coffee ready before 7:15. Bartlett had been my neighbor for 6 years. He drank his coffee on the front porch every morning at 7:15, rain or shine, in the same wooden rocker he had owned longer than I had lived on the street. He was a retired Nashville police detective who had spent 22 years in plainclothes investigation before a knee, surgery, and a reasonable pension convinced him that the city's crimes could be someone else's problem for a while. He was not the kind of man who missed things. He was also not the kind of man who said anything until he had decided it was time. I crossed the driveway at 7:14. He saw me coming and reached for the second rocker without being asked. "Figured you might stop by this week," he said. I handed him the extra cup and sat down. The street was still quiet, the kind of early morning quiet in Belle Meade that feels almost curated. A sprinkler system cycled on 2 houses down. A dog barked once somewhere behind the tree line and went silent. The white Audi Q5, I said. The one that used to park in our driveway. Bartlett wrapped both hands around his coffee and looked out at the street for a moment. Not the hesitation of someone deciding whether to speak. The hesitation of someone deciding how much detail to lead with. "I saw it 4 times, he said, that I wrote down. Might have been a 5th, but I was picking up my grandson from school one afternoon and I can't be certain." He reached into the front pocket of his flannel shirt and pulled out a small spiral notebook, the kind that fit in a breast pocket worn at the corners, the cover soft from years of handling. He had carried a version of that notebook his entire career. Some habits do not retire when the badge does. He opened it to a page near the back and held it out to me. 4 entries, each with a date, a time range, and a license plate number written in the tight economical handwriting of someone trained to take notes quickly and legibly under pressure. The earliest entry was from late spring. The most recent was from 3 weeks ago. I looked at the plate number and thought about the LinkedIn profile I had pulled up the previous afternoon, the professional website listed at the bottom of the page, the contact section that included a photo of Blythe Weston standing beside a sleek white Audi Q5 in what appeared to be an architectural studio parking lot. I had noted the car without fully registering why. The plates matched. "I thought she was a colleague of his," Bartlett said, watching me read. "Someone from a project. Donovan's in real estate development. People come and go from your place for work reasons. I didn't want to knock on your door and suggest something that might turn out to be nothing." "It wasn't nothing," I said. "No." He took a slow sip of coffee. "I figured that out a couple months in, if I'm being honest with you. The visits started being too regular. Same time of day. Always when your car wasn't in the driveway. But by then, I had already waited too long. And telling someone their husband might be having an affair based on a car in the driveway, that's not a conversation. You start easy." He paused. "I'm sorry, I didn't." I looked at his notebook again. 4 entries. Afternoons when I had been at the office building a case against someone else's dishonesty. while a white Audi Q5 sat in my driveway. "The last time," I said. "How long did she stay?" "2 hours," Bartlett said. "Give or take. I was on the porch for most of it." 2 hours. In my house. While I was at the office finding other people's financial lies, I handed his notebook back and stood up. He did not try to fill the silence, which I appreciated. "One more thing," he said before I stepped off the porch. "She had a key. Or a code. More likely, I saw her walk straight to the front door. No waiting, no phone call. Didn't hesitate." That detail settled into me slowly the way cold water spreads when you spill it on a hard surface. Donovan had given her access to our home. Not just his time, not just our money. The physical space of our life together. The kitchen where I made coffee every morning. The hallway I walked through every night. The bedroom where I had lain awake on Monday wondering what I was holding. I walked back across the driveway and let myself in through the front door. I stood at the entrance to the master bedroom and looked in. Everything was exactly where it always was. My reading lamp on the left nightstand, the framed photo from our 10th anniversary trip on the dresser, the quilt folded at the foot of the bed the way I liked it. Nothing had been moved or disturbed. Nothing looked different at all. That was the worst part. Some violations do not leave fingerprints. They leave something worse, the knowledge that someone else had stood exactly where you were standing now, in the quiet of your own home, and that the life you thought was entirely yours had been shared without your knowledge or your consent. I turned off the light and went to get my keys. I had a full day ahead of me, and the investigation had only just begun. I was back inside with my keys on the counter and a fresh cup of coffee in my hand when the phone rang. The screen showed a number I did not recognize, Nashville area code, but not one of the exchanges I associated with anyone in my contacts. My first instinct was to let it go to voicemail. I had things to do and a day that had already started with more information than I'd been prepared for. But something made me pick up. Intuition, maybe. Or just the particular kind of alertness that comes from spending 3 days treating your own life like an open case file. I almost did not answer. I am glad I did. Mrs. Calloway. The voice was measured and unhurried, the kind of voice that belonged to someone accustomed to delivering difficult information calmly. "My name is Rafferty Weston. I'm an emergency medicine physician at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. I don't know how to make this phone call easier, so I'm just going to make it." I set my coffee down. He explained himself in the direct, organized way of someone who had thought through what he needed to say before dialing. He and Blythe Weston had been married for 4 years and divorced for 3. They shared custody of a 9-year-old son. The previous evening, his son had left his tablet at Blythe's apartment after his regular overnight visit. Rafferty had stopped by to pick it up on his way home from a night shift. He worked rotating hours in the emergency department, nights and days, alternating on a 2-week schedule. Blythe had not been home, but she had given him a key for exactly these kinds of handoffs involving their son. He had let himself in, found the tablet on the kitchen counter, and was on his way back out, when Blythe's phone, left face up on the coffee table, had lit up with an incoming message. The name on the notification had read Donovan Calloway, not a first name, not an initial. The full name, the way you save someone in your phone when the relationship is serious enough that you are no longer trying to be careful about it. I stood there for about 30 seconds, Rafferty said. I know how that sounds, reading someone's notifications, but I recognize the last name. Calloway is not a common name in Nashville. And I recognize the context. He had Googled the name before he reached his car. Donovan Calloway came up quickly, professional profile development firm, a few mentions in Nashville business press. The firm's website listed a company directory. The directory listed a Serena Calloway. Her name linked to a page for the forensic accounting firm where she worked with a contact number. He had sat in his car in Blythe's parking lot for 10 minutes before he called. I want to be clear about why I'm calling, he said. It's not to cause trouble. It's not about Blythe and me that's been settled for 3 years, and I have no interest in reopening it. I'm calling because of what I know about how this situation develops, because I've been on the other side of it and no one called me. I asked him what he meant. He He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone deciding how far back to go. He and Blythe had met through a mutual professional connection. He was finishing his residency. She was building her architecture practice. And the introduction had come through a colleague at a fundraising event. She was impressive. She was focused and ambitious, and she had a gift for making you feel like the most interesting person in the room. They were engaged within a year and married 6 months after that. The problems, he said, did not announce themselves. They arrived gradually as patterns rather than incidents. Blythe had a way of cultivating relationships with successful men in industries adjacent to her own real estate developers, commercial property, investors, contractors with expanding portfolios. He had initially read it as networking, which it partly was. Over time, it became something else. The professional admiration would develop into something more personal, and the personal would develop into something that crossed lines he had believed were clear between them. By the time he understood what he was looking at, 14 months of it had already happened. The divorce was not straightforward, he said in the same even tone he had maintained throughout. She had commingled personal and business finances in ways that took 2 years and a forensic accountant of my own to untangle. He paused. No offense intended. None taken, I said. He had lost a significant portion of what he had saved during their marriage. He had spent the following 2 years rebuilding financially, and in the other ways that take longer and cannot be measured in a balance sheet. He was not calling to relitigate any of that. I'm calling because the pattern I saw on that phone screen last night is the same pattern I watched develop in my own life, he said. And because you deserve to know it exists before it gets further along than it may already be. I asked him how he had known to call me specifically and not Donovan, because in my experience, he said the person who needs the information most is rarely the one doing the deceiving. There was a directness to that which I found under the circumstances unexpectedly decent. There's more I could tell you, he said, about her history. Things I learned after the fact that I wish I had known earlier. But I think you should find out what you need to find out first. Then call me back if you want to talk. He left his number. I already had it on my screen. After I ended the call, I stood at the kitchen counter and looked at my coffee. The cup was still sitting where I had set it down when the phone rang. The surface had gone completely still, the way coffee does when it has been left alone long enough to stop moving. 14 years. That was how long it had taken. 14 years of marriage, of building something I believed was real. And it had taken a stranger's phone call on a Wednesday morning, a man I had never met, calling from a parking lot on the other side of Nashville to show me what I had not seen. I'm not someone who uses the word blind easily. I spend my professional life looking for exactly what other people try to hide. I find it, consistently and without apology. But there is a particular kind of blindness that has nothing to do with skill or intelligence. It is the blindness of a person who trusts, and trusts thoroughly, and builds an entire architecture of daily life on top of that trust without ever examining the foundation. I picked up my keys and my bag. The coffee stayed on the counter. By mid-morning, I had a short list of things I knew for certain and a longer list of things I needed to verify. The phone I found behind the sofa cushion was real. The deleted messages and the single remaining text from someone, saved only as B, were real. The $47,000 missing from my joint savings account structured across 94 days in 31 carefully varied transactions was real. The name Blythe Weston and the LLC registered in her name 14 months ago were real. The license plate on her white Audi Q5 matching 4 entries in a retired detective's pocket notebook was real. The assessment of a man who had watched the same pattern unfold in his own marriage and called me from a parking lot because he believed I deserved to know that felt. In every meaningful way real. What I did not yet know was whether there had ever been a conference in Austin at all. I had spent 15 years proving financial fraud for a living. The strangest part of picking up the phone to call my husband's employer was the quiet realization that I should have done something like this years ago. Not because I had reason to be suspicious, But because I was someone who verified things professionally, and I had never once applied that instinct to my own home, Harwick's assistant put me through without much delay. His name was on the company website as Chief Executive Officer, and I had met him twice at industry events over the years, the kind of professional acquaintance that exists at the comfortable edges of a spouse's work life. He picked up on the third ring. I kept it straightforward. I told him I was trying to reach Donovan about a scheduling matter and wanted to confirm the dates of his Austin presentation before I made other arrangements. It was not the whole truth, but it was enough to open the conversation without putting him on the defensive. The silence that followed lasted long enough that I moved the phone slightly away from my ear to check that the call was still connected. "Mrs. Calloway," Harwick said slowly, "I'm not sure what presentation you're referring to. We don't have anything scheduled in Austin this week. We don't have anything scheduled in Austin this quarter." I asked him to double check. "I don't need to," he said. "I approved all travel requests personally this month. Donovan submitted a personal leave request on Thursday. Family emergency, he said. 4 days starting Monday." I wrote the words "family emergency" on the notepad in front of me underneath Blythe Weston's name and the column I had started 2 days ago. 2 different stories. One for me, a conference, a presentation, 18 months of project work. One for his employer, a family emergency, something personal, something that required no corroboration. Neither of them true. Harwick was quiet for a moment. Then I heard the sound of a keyboard. "While I have you," he said, and the register of his voice had shifted slightly, still professional, but with the particular attentiveness of someone who has just noticed something that requires closer examination. "Can I ask what prompted you to call about his schedule?" I told him carefully and without embellishment that I had reason to believe Donovan had been representing his whereabouts inaccurately, and that some of the financial discrepancies I had come across appeared to involve business relationships connected to his work. Another pause. More keyboard sounds. Harwick was the kind of executive who had built his company by understanding where money went. He did not ask me to elaborate. He simply pulled up what he needed and looked at it. "I'm looking at his expense submissions for the past 7 months," he said. "There are entries here that I need to flag." His tone had gone fully into professional mode, now measured careful. The voice of someone managing a problem in real time. Hotel charges in Nashville and Memphis, restaurant bills well above what any client meeting would justify, 2 spa charges that I cannot attach to any client account. He named the total, $12,400, submitted across 14 separate expense reports, each one individually plausible enough that no single entry would have drawn immediate scrutiny. As a pattern, they told a different story. I recognized the methodology. The same logic that had structured the withdrawals from my joint savings account had apparently been applied. To Donovan's corporate expense reporting, keep each piece small enough to pass without triggering review. Vary the amounts and the categories, spread the submissions across enough time that no single report raised a flag. He had been thorough, I will give him that. "Mrs. Calloway." Harwick said, "I think we need to have a very serious conversation about your husband's expense account, and I think I need to open an internal investigation before the day is out. Under federal law and standard corporate governance practice, using company expense accounts for personal purposes, particularly when those purposes involve concealing a relationship that creates a conflict of interest, can constitute employee fraud. Depending on the amount and circumstances, it can also trigger civil liability. $12,000 was not a minor discrepancy. It was the kind of number that ended careers. I told Harwick I understood and that I appreciated him taking it seriously. I gave him my direct line in case he needed documentation from my end. After I ended the call, I stood at my office window for a moment. 12 floors below Midtown Nashville moved through its ordinary Wednesday. Delivery trucks, lunch crowds beginning to form outside the restaurants on the main corridor. A couple walking a dog along the sidewalk, the dog pausing to investigate something in the grass with great seriousness. Ordinary life going about its business. Somewhere not Austin, not any business destination he had ever named Donovan, was spending 4 days believing his life was still intact, believing that the version of events he had constructed was holding together, believing that when he came home on Friday evening with whatever story he had prepared, the woman waiting in the kitchen would be the same one he had kissed goodbye on Monday morning. He had until Friday evening to hold on to that belief. I picked up my pen and added a second column to my notepad right beside Blythe Weston's name. The numbers were adding up, and in my experience, numbers always finished what they started. Before I reveal what arrived in Serena's inbox that Thursday afternoon, something that changed everything she thought she already knew, drop a number 7 in the comments to let me know you're still here with me. A quick note, the story continuing from here contains fictionalized elements woven in for narrative depth. Some details may not reflect any single lived experience, and if this kind of story isn't for you, this is a perfectly good place to step away. No hard feelings. Thursday had been a quiet day up until 2:17 in the afternoon. I had spent the morning finishing a client report that had been due since Tuesday, and which I had managed to complete in spite of everything. Because the work did not stop moving simply because my personal life had decided to come apart. That was in its own way a mercy. There is something stabilizing about spreadsheets when the rest of your world has gone unreliable. Numbers do not revise their meaning overnight. They do not have hidden motives. A column either balances or it does not. By early afternoon, I had submitted the report, returned 3 client emails, and eaten half a sandwich at my desk. Outside the office windows, Nashville was doing what Nashville does in July, sitting under a white sky, humid and unhurried, the kind of afternoon heat that makes the whole city move at a slightly reduced pace. The message arrived at 2:17. My work phone showed an unknown number, not a Nashville area code, not any exchange I recognized. The preview showed no name, no context, just the text of the message itself and an image attachment. 6 words. You should know this. I opened the attachment. It was a screenshot of a text conversation. The contact name at the top of the thread read, Cassidy no last name, just the first, the way close friends save each other in their phones. The exchange was dated 3 days earlier, which placed it on Monday morning. The morning Donovan had loaded his suitcase into a car service sedan and driven away from our house on Belle Meade Boulevard, while I stood in the doorway finishing my coffee. I read it twice before I called Marlo in from the adjacent office. She came in carrying her reading glasses and a pen, took one look at my face, and sat down across the desk without asking any questions. I turned the phone toward her. The conversation between Blythe and Cassidy had the particular texture of 2 people who had been friends long enough to be direct with each other. Blythe's side of the exchange read like someone who had finally decided to say out loud what she had been thinking privately for some time. The tone was not guilty or conflicted. It was certain. In the way that people become certain when they have been planning something long enough that it has started to feel inevitable. She was 9 weeks pregnant. She was sure of the timing. She was going to tell him in person in Austin, where they would have 4 uninterrupted days to work through what came next. She wrote that he had promised her. Not recently, not impulsively, but consistently over the course of the previous several months. In the way that a person promises when they want someone to believe the promise is serious. He had told her that what they had was not temporary, that he was going to make a decision, that when the time was right, they would leave Nashville together and start over somewhere else. Denver had come up more than once, a city neither of them had strong ties to, large enough to disappear into far enough away to feel like a clean break. Cassidy's responses had not matched Blythe's tone. The pushback started gently and became less gentle as the thread progressed. Cassidy had written, in the plain language of someone who had finally lost patience with a conversation they had been having for too long. This is wrong, Blythe. She doesn't deserve this. And then, a few messages later, you keep saying he's going to choose you. What if he doesn't? What happens to the baby then? Blythe had not answered that question directly. Marlo set the phone down on the desk between us and took off her reading glasses. She wasn't just having an affair, Serena, she said. She was building a replacement life. With your husband, using your money. The accuracy of that summary did not require a response. I looked at the timestamp again, Monday morning. Cassidy had sent this to me or to someone she believed was me, or to whoever she could find within hours of Donovan leaving the house. She had found my contact information the same way Rafferty had the same way anyone with a name and a Google search could find a professional in this city. My firm's website listed a general contact number. It had taken her less effort than she probably expected. She had not signed the message. She had not included any explanation. But the screenshot showed the thread from Cassidy's side of the conversation, her name visible at the top of her own screen, the way it appears when you capture your own messages. She had sent me her own words, just the screenshot and 6 words, from a woman who had apparently reached the limit of what she was willing to stay silent about. There was something in that I recognized. The particular discomfort of knowing something and deciding that the cost of staying quiet was higher than the cost of speaking. I had seen it in witnesses before, not the dramatic courtroom kind of witness, but the ordinary kind. A colleague who noticed a pattern in the accounts. A neighbor who wrote down a license plate number in a small spiral notebook. People, it turns out, generally know when something is wrong. The variable is whether they do anything about it. "I need to make a call," I said. Marlo picked up the phone from my desk and handed it back to me without comment. Then she stood, gathered her reading glasses, and walked back toward her office, pulling the door most of the way closed behind her close enough to give me privacy, open enough that she was still there if I needed her. I dialed from memory. I had referred clients to Aldridge before. I knew what he was capable of. I had not until this evening needed his particular set of skills on my own behalf. He picked up on the second ring. "I need to see you tonight," I said. "Clear your evening." A brief pause. "How much documentation do you have?" "Enough," I said. "Possibly more than enough." 7 o'clock, he said. "My office. Bring everything." I ended the call and sat for a moment in the quiet of my office looking at the screenshot still open on my phone. Somewhere on the other side of that conversation, a woman named Cassidy had made a choice that cost her something: loyalty friendship, the comfortable ease of not getting involved. She had made it anyway. On the other side of that choice, whatever came next was already in motion. The building that housed Aldridge's law firm stood on a corner in downtown Nashville, where the older architecture had not yet been replaced by glass and steel. 6 floors of limestone and dark brick. The kind of building that looked like it had opinions about the newer developments going up around it. The lobby directory still used raised brass letters. The elevator was slow in the particular way of elevators that have never needed to hurry. His office was on the 5th floor at the end of a corridor lined with closed doors and the muted hum of a building running on skeleton staff after hours. The light under his door was the only one still on. He opened the door before I knocked, which meant he had been listening for the elevator. Ms. Calloway. He stepped back to let me in. No handshake, no small talk, the specific efficiency of someone who understood that the person across from him did not come here tonight for pleasantries. His desk was clear except for a legal pad, 2 pens, and a glass of water. He gestured to the chair across from him and sat down, and I set my folder on the desk between us and began. I presented the documentation the way I presented any financial fraud case, chronologically, methodically, each element connected to the next by a clear chain of evidence. The joint savings account and the 31 structured transfers, totaling $47,000, each one kept deliberately below reporting thresholds. The destination account. BW Design Consulting, LLC, a single-member Tennessee company registered 14 months ago. The sole member, Blythe Weston, licensed architect studio in the Gulch. The license plate recorded 4 times by a retired Nashville detective in a pocket notebook matched to a vehicle registered to the same individual. The employer confirmation that no Austin presentation had ever existed, and that the man who told his wife he was traveling for work had instead filed a personal leave request under the pretense of a family emergency. The expense account, irregularities $12,000, $400 across 7 months submitted in increments too small to trigger individual review, attached to no legitimate client account. And finally, the screenshot. 9 weeks a name, a city a plan. Aldridge wrote without looking up. His handwriting was small and even the kind that covered a lot of ground without wasting space. He did not interrupt once. When I finished, he set down his pen and read back through his notes for approximately 90 seconds. Then he looked at me across the desk. "Let me walk you through how this sits legally," he said. Tennessee is what attorneys call a fault-based divorce state, which means the grounds on which a divorce is filed can carry weight in the court's decisions about asset division. Adultery is recognized as fault grounds under Tennessee law. When fault is established, a court has discretion to factor that into how marital property is divided, not automatically and not always dramatically, but the option exists. The more significant issue, he explained, was the financial conduct. In Tennessee, when one spouse uses marital assets, money belonging to both parties, to fund an extramarital relationship, it is classified as dissipation of marital assets. The $47,000 transferred from the joint savings account into Blythe Weston's LLC constituted in his assessment a textbook dissipation case. Before the marital estate was divided, a court could order that amount credited back to Serena's share, effectively requiring Donovan to account for what he had taken. The corporate expense fraud was a separate matter. That was between Donovan and his employer, and Harwick had already indicated he intended to pursue it independently. Then there was the house. I had purchased the Belmead property in my name 2 years before Donovan and I married. Under Tennessee law, assets acquired before marriage are classified as separate property and are generally not subject to division in a divorce. The complication Aldridge noted was that 14 years of mortgage payments made from marital funds could give Donovan a claim to a marital interest in the appreciated value of the property. However, he said, with the measured delivery of someone who had done this long enough to know where the leverage was, given the documented dissipation of marital assets, the fault grounds, and the totality of what you've brought me tonight, we have a very strong basis for an offset argument. His marital interest in the property, if any, would reasonably be absorbed by the amount he owes back to the marital estate. He slid a retainer agreement across the desk. I read it, which he expected, and signed it, which he was ready for. "Any questions before I start drafting?" he asked. "How long will the filing take?" "I can have the petition ready by tomorrow afternoon. We file Friday, which means he'll be served before the weekend is out." He paused. "How are you holding up?" I thought about the question for a moment. It was the first time anyone had asked it plainly without a follow-up or an agenda. "I'll tell you when it's over," I said. He accepted that without comment, which was the correct response. He set his pen down and looked at me with the particular expression of someone who was about to say something that was not strictly part of his professional role. In 20 years of divorce law, he said, "I have never had a client walk in with documentation this complete. The structuring analysis, the LLC trace, the expense account pattern, he did not understand who he was married to." I picked up my copy of the retainer agreement and folded it into my bag. "No," I said, "he didn't. The drive back to Belmead took 20 minutes on nearly empty streets. Nashville at 11 on a weeknight was a different city than Nashville at noon, quieter, slower. The lights of the downtown skyline reflecting in the Cumberland River as I crossed the bridge. I kept the radio off. Tomorrow I would begin the legal dismantling of 14 years. I would walk into this house and start making it ready for what came next. I was not sad about that. I was focused. There is a meaningful difference between the two, and I had spent enough of the past 4 days understanding the distinction to know which one I was operating from. Sadness looks backward. Focus moves forward. I started at 6:15 before the light had fully decided what kind of morning it was going to be. The moving boxes were already in the garage, a dozen of them flat and stacked. Left over from when we had renovated the upstairs hallway 2 years ago and temporarily relocated everything while the floors were refinished. I had noticed them last week without registering why I was noticing them. Now I understood. Some part of me had been doing inventory for longer than I had been willing to admit. I packed 14 years of marriage in one Friday. It turns out that when you are clear about what you are doing and why it does not take very long. I began in his home office because it was the room with the least history. His desk files, his reference books, the framed industry awards he kept on the shelf above the monitor. I worked without music, without the television on in the background, without any of the ambient noise I usually needed to make a quiet house feel inhabited. The silence that morning was not uncomfortable. It was simply accurate. By 7:30, I had moved to the master bedroom closet, his side the right side. With the built-in shelving he had specifically requested during the renovation, held the organized evidence of 14 years of professional success. Suits arranged by weight shirts by color, shoes on the lower rack in ascending order of formality. He had always been meticulous about his presentation. I folded each item with the same care he would have used. Not because he deserved the consideration, but because I was not going to let this process become something ugly just because what prompted it was. Marlo arrived at 9 with 2 coffees and a truck full of additional boxes she had picked up from the U-Haul on Murfreesboro Road. She did not ask how I was doing. She set one coffee on the dresser, took the other with her, and started on the bathroom without being directed. Bartlett showed up at 9:45 with his pickup truck backed into the driveway, the tailgate already down. He was wearing his usual flannel shirt despite the July heat and carrying a roll of packing tape. "Where do you want me?" he said. "Living room first," I said. His book's the bar cart, the record collection. He nodded and got to work. There is a particular quality to packing up a shared life with people who do not require explanation. Marlo had heard enough over the past 4 days to understand the shape of it. Bartlett had watched it from his porch for months and probably understood more than I had. Neither of them needed me to justify what we were doing or perform any particular emotion while we did it. We just worked. The objects themselves were the difficult part, not because I wanted to keep them, but because each one carried the accumulated weight of years that had been real, even when the person I shared them with was not fully who I believed him to be. A coffee table book about Nashville architecture that we had bought at the Frist Museum on our 3rd anniversary, a cast-iron skillet that had been his before we married, seasoned and heavy, which he used every Sunday morning when he made breakfast, a set of cufflinks his father had given him. These things did not stop being what they were because of what I had learned this week. They just stopped being mine to hold on to. I did not cry. I am not saying that to claim strength I did not have. I say it because it is accurate. The grief I had expected to feel had been replaced over the course of 4 days by something steadier and colder, not numbness, but clarity. The kind of clarity that comes when you have finally seen the full picture and understand exactly what you are looking at. The drawer was the last thing I opened. It was the bottom drawer of the nightstand on Donovan's side of the bed, the left side closer to the door, where he kept his watch charger and his reading glasses, and the occasional book he would start and not finish. I had never opened that drawer in 14 years. Not because I was told not to, simply because it was his and I had never had reason to. I opened it to check whether anything needed to be packed. There was a small box at the back pushed against the far corner underneath a folded phone charger and a business card from a Nashville restaurant I did not recognize. The box was the size of a ring box navy blue, the kind that comes from a jewelry store rather than a drugstore. The kind you do not put in a nightstand drawer unless you have specifically chosen to keep it close. I opened it. A gold band. Simple in design, narrow, the kind of ring that could be worn on any finger without drawing attention. Not an engagement ring. Not a wedding band. Something else, the kind of thing you give someone when you want to mark a commitment without it being visible to the life you are publicly living. The inside of the band had an engraving. Small letters evenly spaced. B and D always. I stood at the side of the bed for a moment, holding the box. Marlo had come into the doorway at some point and was standing very still. Bartlett, who had been stacking boxes in the hallway, had gone quiet. I set the box down gently on top of the manila envelope that held the divorce filing paperwork, the documents Aldridge had messengered to the house that afternoon, along with his card and a brief handwritten note that said simply, "Filed at 2:14 p.m. He could have the ring back. The ring, the promises it was supposed to represent, and everything else I no longer had use for. No one said anything. After a moment, Marlowe picked up the last empty box and went back to the bathroom. Bartlett returned to the hallway. I went to the kitchen to check that nothing had been left in the cabinets. By 4 o'clock, the house was quiet in a different way than it had been at 6:15 that morning. His office held only furniture. His closet held only hangers. His side of the bathroom counter was bare. The boxes and bags were stacked in the living room, and the front hall organized by room and labeled in Marlowe's handwriting. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. A text from Bartlett sent from across the driveway where he had returned to his porch after loading the last of the boxes. His car just turned onto the street. 10 minutes. I looked at the message. Then I looked at the room around me, the house that had been mine before it was ours, and which was now in every way that mattered becoming mine again. I picked up my keys, my bag, and the extra coffee Marlowe had left on the counter. Then I walked out the front door, got in my car, and drove away before he reached the driveway. Bongo Java sat on Belmont Boulevard about 3 miles from Belle Meade, in a neighborhood where the houses got smaller and the coffee got better. I had been coming here since before I moved to Belle Meade, back when I lived in a 1-bedroom on Ackland Avenue and walked here on Saturday mornings because I couldn't yet afford to own the kind of coffee machine that made staying home worthwhile. I had not planned to come here specifically. I had simply driven the way you drive when you need to be somewhere that is not where you just were. This was where I ended up. There are worse instincts. I was sitting in the far corner of the parking lot engine, off a drive-through coffee going lukewarm in my hand, when Bartlett sent the second message. He's inside. The first had come 8 minutes earlier when I was 3 blocks away and still deciding whether to pull in he's home. 2 words. The economy of a man who had spent decades writing reports that needed to convey maximum information in minimum space. I sat and thought about the house I had left 45 minutes ago. The cleared bookshelves, the bar cart gone from the corner, the master bedroom closet with its empty right side. The boxes that had been stacked in the hallway this morning and were now gone, relocated to a storage unit on Charlotte Avenue that Bartlett had arranged without being asked, and the manila envelope on the kitchen table. Bartlett's third message came 4 minutes later. He found the envelope. I took a sip of coffee. Inside that envelope, the divorce petition filed at 2:14 p.m. with Davidson County Circuit Court. The financial summary, $47,000. 31 structured transfers over 94 days. The expense account analysis. Aldridge's business card clipped to the corner. And on top of everything in its small navy blue box, the ring. I had left it there deliberately. It belonged to whatever accounting he was going to have to make of the past several months. I did not want it in my house. He's been standing in the bedroom for 5 minutes. I set the cup in the holder and looked out at the parking lot. A couple walked toward the entrance, the woman gesturing as she talked. A teenager on a bicycle cut through without stopping. A perfectly ordinary Friday evening in Nashville, moving at its own pace, completely indifferent to what was happening 3 miles away on Belle Meade Boulevard. My phone rang. Donovan's name on the screen. His main number, the one I had known for 14 years. I let it ring out. He called again. I watched, let it ring. Third call. I took another sip. Fourth. A text appeared between rings. Serena, please pick up. I need to explain. I looked at it without responding. 5th, 6th, 7th. Bartlett's message arrived between the 7th and 8th. He just sat down on the front steps. Looks like a man who finally understood something he should have figured out a long time ago. I read that twice. It landed with more weight than I expected. Not satisfaction, not grief. Something more specific. The feeling of watching the last variable in a long equation finally resolve into a number that made sense. 8th call, 9th, 10th. 11 calls, 14 years. I picked up on the 11th. Hello, Donovan. My voice came out even and unhurried, the tone I used when a client called with news I had already anticipated. The tone of someone who has all the relevant information and is simply waiting to hear what the other party has decided to say about it. Before I walk you through the call that ended 14 years of marriage in 11 minutes, the moment Serena said everything she had spent 5 days preparing to say comment, I'm still here, so I know you made it this far. Note what follows includes fictionalized elements shaped for storytelling purposes. If you'd rather not continue, this is your moment to step away, no judgment. But if you're staying, you'll want to hear this call. The Bongo Java parking lot had thinned out by 9 o'clock, but it hadn't emptied. A few cars idled near the entrance. A pair of women in scrubs walked out with paper bags and tall cups, laughing about something I couldn't hear through my closed windows. Nashville on a Friday night had no particular interest in the fact that 14 years of my life were being quietly, methodically concluded in row 3 of a parking structure on Belmont Boulevard. I had not moved my car. I'd thought about it. Around 7, I'd turn the key in the ignition, let the engine run, then shut it off again. There was a motel on Nolensville Pike with my name on a reservation, a clean room, a quiet bed, a place that belonged entirely to me for the next 30 days, while Aldridge's filing worked its way through Davidson County Circuit Court. I would get there, just not yet. My phone sat face up on the passenger seat. It had been ringing at intervals since 6:47 p.m. when I'd answered long enough to say hello, Donovan, and let the weight of those 2 words do what 14 years of ordinary conversation never had. That call had lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. I'd listened, said nothing further, and ended it. Since then, 9 more attempts, voicemails I hadn't played, a single text that read, "Please, just talk to me." At 9:14 p.m., it rang again. I watched his name on the screen for 1 full ring. Then I picked up. Serena. His voice carried that particular tightness I recognized from failed negotiations, controlled but only barely. The voice of a man who had rehearsed his opening line multiple times in the last 2 hours and still wasn't sure it would land. "Serena, I need you to listen to me." "I'm listening," I said. The pause that followed told me everything about what he'd been expecting. Tears, probably, or a locked door and a changed code, or silence that meant I'd handed the phone to a lawyer already. He hadn't expected "I'm listening," delivered in the same tone I used when a client's CFO was about to explain why $3 million had gone sideways in a quarterly report. "I can explain it," he said. "I know how it looks. I know what you found, and I understand you're upset. But Blythe is a business partner, Serena. That's all she is. The transfers, that was project capital. I was routing development funds through a separate entity to keep the accounting clean. And I should have told you I know that. But it wasn't, Donovan." He stopped. "Let me tell you what I know," I said. I'd been a forensic accountant for 15 years. I'd sat across from executives, partners, and CFOs who were very good liars, men and women who'd had months to construct their stories, who'd retained expensive attorneys before the first interview, who'd walked into rooms believing their version of events was airtight. I had learned over those 15 years that the most effective thing you can do in that room is not argue. You don't push back. You don't express disbelief. You simply state what the evidence shows in order, and you let each fact land before you move to the next one. I applied the same method now. Between March 4th and June 5th of this year, I said $47,000 was transferred from our joint savings account in 31 separate transactions. The amounts varied between $800 and $4,200. None of them crossed the $10,000 federal reporting threshold. I paused. That pattern has a name, Donovan. We use it in court. Silence. The receiving account belongs to a limited liability company registered with the Tennessee Secretary of State. Single-member structure. Filed in February of this year, approximately 6 weeks after you began the Blythe Weston project. Another pause. The registered agent and sole member of BW Design Consulting, LLC, is an architect with a studio in the Gulch. Her name is on the registration documents, her LinkedIn profile, and the lease agreement for the office space on 12th Avenue South. The silence on his end had changed. The first silence had been the silence of a man searching for a pivot. This one was different. This was the silence of someone watching the exits, close. There was no conference in Austin. Why? I continued. I spoke with Harwick yesterday morning. He confirmed your leave was filed as a personal family emergency. When I described the nature of the expenses attached to your corporate card over the past 7 months, hotel charges, restaurant tabs, 2 spa appointments, all tied to a vendor that does not appear in any active project file. He opened an internal investigation before we finished the call. I kept my voice level. The total is $12,400. That number is now in Harwick's hands, not just mine. I heard him breathe. Just breathe. The way people do when they're trying to find solid ground and discovering there isn't any. Serena, listen. We can get past this. We can sit down, we can talk to someone, a counselor, whatever you need. This doesn't have to... Ring Donovan. He went quiet. The one in the navy blue box, in the hidden drawer of your nightstand. The one engraved on the inside. I kept my voice exactly where it had been for the last 4 minutes, measured, unhurried. The voice of someone reading figures from a spreadsheet. Would you like to tell me about it? The silence that followed was the longest one yet. I had interviewed a man, once a logistics director at a distribution company outside of Memphis, who had been skimming from his employer for 4 years. When I placed the summary sheet in front of him and pointed to the total, he didn't speak for nearly 90 seconds. Later, his attorney told me it was the moment his client realized that denial wasn't a viable position anymore, that everything he'd built, everything he'd maintained through careful misdirection and selective truth-telling had been reduced to a single sheet of paper with his name at the top. Donovan's silence felt like that. It wasn't the silence of someone formulating a response. It wasn't the silence of someone deciding whether to tell the truth. It was the silence of a man watching the architecture of a very careful set of lies collapse simultaneously, every supporting beam giving way at once. The whole structure folding inward in the span of a single exhaled breath. That silence told me everything his words never had. I've been doing forensic accounting for 15 years, I said. Finding the truth is my job. The paperwork was filed this afternoon with Davidson County Circuit Court. Aldridge's office number is on the card I left with the documents. I reached for the ignition. Call them Monday morning if you want to discuss terms. I ended the call before he could answer. The parking lot was quieter now. The women in scrubs were gone. The cars near the entrance had thinned to 3. Somewhere on Belmont Boulevard, a bus pulled away from a stop with a hydraulic sigh, its lights cutting briefly across my windshield before it disappeared around the curve. I sat for another moment with my phone in my lap and the engine running. Then I pulled out of Bongo Java, turned south on Belmont, and drove toward Nolensville Pike. I was almost to the motel when my phone lit up again on the seat beside me. Not Donovan's name this time. A number I didn't recognize. Nashville area code. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times. Then the screen went dark. A voicemail notification appeared 4 seconds later. I didn't play it. Not yet. I pulled into the motel parking lot, found a space near the stairwell, and sat in the silence of a car that was for the first time in 14 years entirely mine. I would listen to that message in 43 minutes. I did not know yet who had left it. I didn't know what she was going to say or how her voice would sound sharp and certain, the way it would when someone is operating from a position they believe is still defensible. I only knew that the night wasn't finished. The motel room on Nolensville Pike was clean in the way that motel rooms are clean. Surfaces, wiped corners, vacuumed. Everything arranged to suggest no one had ever been there before, and no one would remember being there after. A painting of a Tennessee landscape hung above the bed, a generic rendering of fall foliage that could have been anywhere and was therefore nowhere. I had pulled the desk chair to face the window which looked out onto the parking lot, and beyond it, the low glow of Nashville's south side against a cloudy sky. I had not slept. I'd tried. I'd turned off the lights at 10, lain on top of the covers in my clothes, and stared at the ceiling until the shapes in the darkness stopped being interesting. Then I'd sat up, turned on the desk lamp, and opened my laptop to a blank document I had no intention of filling. Around 11, I'd made a cup of bad coffee from the machine on the dresser and carried it to the window. The voicemail had come in at 9:31 p.m. while I was still in the parking lot at Bongo Java. I'd played it once sitting in the car with the engine off. 17 seconds. A woman's voice steady at the start, the kind of steady that takes deliberate effort, saying she needed to speak with me and that she would call back. No name. No explanation. The kind of message someone leaves when they've rehearsed it 4 times and still aren't sure how to begin. I had recognized the particular quality of that steadiness. It was the steadiness of someone who was angry and working very hard not to sound like it. At 11:32 p.m., the number called again. I let it ring twice. I watched the Nashville glow through the window. Then I answered. "I found your number on your firm's website," she said. No greeting, no name. She didn't need to offer either. "It's a public listing." You would know someone's voice if they had been inside your home. Not from a recording, not from a photograph, from the particular resonance of a voice moving through rooms that belong to you. I had never met Blythe Weston. I had seen her LinkedIn photograph a professional headshot with a confident smile and the kind of bone structure that photographs well in natural light. I had seen her name on a Tennessee Secretary of State registration form. I had seen her car's license plate in Bartlett's careful handwriting. But I knew her voice because she had been in my house. She had walked through my kitchen, sat on furniture I'd chosen, breathed the same air that moved through windows I'd opened every summer morning for 11 years. A voice carries a place with it even when you've never heard it speak. "I know who you are," I said. A pause. She'd expected denial or confusion or the defensive opening of a woman who didn't yet know what she was dealing with. She recalibrated quickly. I could hear it, the small shift, the pivot. "Then you know why I'm calling," she said. "I think we need to have an honest conversation." "I'm open to that," I said. "Go ahead." What followed was not at first a conversation. It was a prepared statement. She had clearly spent some portion of the last several hours organizing her thoughts, and what came out was structured in the way that emotionally rehearsed arguments tend to be confident in its opening, shakier in its transitions, with a quality of practiced certainty that is distinctly different from the certainty of someone telling the truth. "You need to let him go," she said. "I'm not saying this to be cruel. I'm saying it because you've been holding on to something that stopped being real a long time ago. He's been unhappy. I know that's hard to hear, but it's true. Whatever you two had, it ran its course. You have to know that on some level." I let her finish. "What exactly did he promise you, Blythe?" I asked. The shift was immediate and subtle, the way a room changes when a door opens somewhere else in the house, a change in pressure more than sound. She hadn't expected that question. She'd expected defense. She'd expected me to contest the premise, to argue about the state of my marriage, to make it personal. "He loves me," she said. "That's not something I need to justify to you." "I'm not asking you to justify it," I said. "I'm asking what he promised, specifically." A longer pause this time. "He said he was going to leave," she said, "when the time was right, when things were settled." "What things?" The project, the financial situation. He wanted everything in order before he said anything to you. He didn't want to hurt you unnecessarily. "And Denver," I said. The silence that followed that word was different from the silences before it. The previous pauses had been tactical, her mind working, adjusting, deciding what to give and what to hold. This silence was something else. This was the silence of someone who had just realized that the shape of a conversation was not what she'd thought it was when she walked into it. "How do you know about Denver?" she asked. Her voice had changed. Not broken, not yet, but the edges of it had softened in a way that had nothing to do with kindness. It was the softening that happens when certainty begins to loosen its grip. "Did he know about the pregnancy before he left for Austin?" I asked. The question landed the way I'd intended, cleanly, without emphasis, as a simple request for a factual answer, which it was. The silence stretched. 5 seconds, 7. "How do you know about that?" she said. It wasn't a question anymore. It was something quieter than a question. Something that was beginning to understand that the conversation had a different architecture than she'd planned for. "Did he know, Blythe?" "I was going to tell him," she said. "In person, face to face. It wasn't I wanted to see him when I told him. I wanted to be there when—" She stopped, started again. It was supposed to be this weekend. That was the plan. That was why Austin was... She stopped again. I heard it the moment she heard herself. The moment the internal logic of what she was saying, which had presumably been airtight for weeks, developed its first visible crack. She had arranged everything around a plan that required a man to know something he did not yet know. She had built a future on a foundation that existed entirely on her side of the conversation. He doesn't know, I said, not a question. I was going to tell him this weekend. Her voice was smaller now, not broken but hollowed out in a particular way, the way a room sounds after furniture has been removed. He promised. He said when the right time came, we'd... He said always, I said quietly. A pause. What? The ring. The engraving. I looked down at my own hands on the desk in front of me. Bare now ring, removed 2 days ago, and placed in a bowl on the bathroom counter of a house I no longer lived in. He used that word with me, too, a long time ago. The silence that came after that was the longest one of the entire conversation. When she spoke again, the steadiness was gone. Not dramatically, she was not a woman who collapsed in the way of movies or television. It was more like watching something structural give way quietly, in the dark where no one photographs it. He promised me, she said. He looked me in the eye and he said, call him, I said, right now tonight. Tell him about the pregnancy. Ask him directly what he's planning to do. Ask him, I said, not what he told you he would do. Ask him what he's actually going to do right now, tonight. I heard her breath catch, just once. Then nothing. Good night, Blythe, I said. I ended the call. I set the phone face down on the desk. I looked up at the ceiling of the motel room, the same smooth expanse of institutional white that ceilings everywhere tend to be unmarked and indifferent. Outside, a truck moved south on Nolensville Pike. Its headlights swept briefly across the window and disappeared. I thought about what it cost to build a life around a promise that someone made in a moment when promising was easy. I had done it myself 14 years ago in a different city. Wearing a dress I'd spent 4 months looking for in front of people who'd driven in from 4 different states to watch 2 people say words that were supposed to mean something permanent. I did not feel sorry for Blythe Weston, but I did not feel nothing either. The coffee on the desk had gone cold. I turned off the desk lamp and lay back down on the bed in the dark, still in my clothes, and looked at the ceiling I couldn't see anymore. I had been awake for 19 hours. At 1:47 a.m., the phone rang again. Emergency physicians keep strange hours, I say that without complaint, simply as a fact about a profession I had come to know indirectly over the past week. Rafferty Weston called at 1:47 in the morning. I was still awake. I had moved from the bed to the small table near the window sometime after midnight. The motel room had one of those narrow tables that extended stay properties install as a gesture toward functionality, just wide enough for a laptop and a coffee cup, positioned beside the window so that a person sitting there could, if they chose, look out at whatever the night had to offer. What it offered on Nolensville Pike at 1:30 in the morning was not much. The parking lot, a gas station sign. 2 blocks south, the low persistent glow of a city that never goes entirely dark. I had not turned on the overhead light. The lamp on the nightstand threw a narrow circle of yellow across the carpet, enough to see by. Enough to sit in without feeling like I was waiting for something, which I was. When the phone rang, I looked at the screen. The same number as Wednesday morning, the one I'd saved simply as R. Weston after our first call with no other notation. I answered on the second ring. I wasn't sure if you'd still be up, he said. I said. Are you at the hospital? Just finished a shift, sitting in my car in the parking garage. A brief pause. I heard from Donovan tonight. I set down the coffee cup I'd been holding. When, about 12:30, he called my cell. Rafferty's voice had the particular flatness of someone who has been awake for an extended period and has moved past tiredness into a kind of clear, slightly detached calm. I recognized it. I was operating from a similar place myself. He wanted me to stop talking to you. Those were his words. Stop talking to her. He said you were going through a difficult time and that outside information was making things worse. What did you tell him? I told him I'd already said what I had to say and that I had no particular reason to change that. A short pause. He wasn't happy about it. No, I said. I imagine he wasn't. There was a quality to the silence that followed. Not uncomfortable, not the silence of two people deciding what to say next, but the silence of two people who had been awake too long and had moved past the point where silence needed filling. I'd noticed it on our first call as well. Rafferty Weston was not a man who spoke to hear himself speak. I told you on Wednesday that there was more, he said. I said you should look into things yourself first. I meant that I didn't want to be the person handing you a case against your own marriage. But I think at this point that particular concern is behind us. It is, I said. Blythe and I were married for 6 years, he said. We have a son. He's 9. He lives primarily with me has since the divorce, which was 3 years ago. That part you probably know from what I told you before. You mentioned him, I said. What I didn't mention, he said, and his voice shifted slightly, not harder exactly, but more deliberate. The way a person's voice changes when they are moving from context into the thing the context was scaffolding was why the divorce happened the way it did. I didn't say anything. I had learned over 15 years of interviews and depositions that the most important thing you can do when someone is about to tell you something true is to stop helping them get there. During our marriage, Blythe became pregnant twice, he said. The first time was in our 3rd year. She told me about it after she'd already terminated the pregnancy. When I asked her why she hadn't told me before, she said she'd been planning to use it. Those were the words she used, use it to push me toward a decision she felt I was avoiding. When it became clear I wasn't going to respond the way she expected, she decided there was no point. The gas station sign 2 blocks south cycled through its display. A car moved through the parking lot below headlights, sweeping the window for a moment before it turned north. The second time was in our 5th year, Rafferty continued. I didn't find out until afterward. Same pattern she'd intended to tell me in a way that would force a specific outcome. When the situation changed and the leverage wasn't there, the pregnancy ended. He paused. I want to be precise about something. I'm not making a moral judgment about the decision itself. I'm describing the mechanism the way it was being used, as a tool, contingent on whether it was working. The lamp on the nightstand made a small sound, the subtle tick of a bulb that has been on for a while. I looked at the yellow circle it threw on the carpet and thought about the word contingent, about the way some people related to the most significant things in their own lives as instruments toward other ends. She uses pregnancy as leverage, I said. Not a question, a restatement to make sure I had understood him correctly. Yes, he said. When it works, she keeps it. When it doesn't produce the outcome she wanted, she removes it. Another pause. I don't know what she's intending with the current situation. I only know the pattern. She doesn't know that Donovan knows, I said, about the pregnancy. She was going to tell him in Austin. A silence. He doesn't know. She intended to tell him this weekend. Face to face. I looked out at the parking lot. She called me tonight. She told me herself without meaning to. Rafferty was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed in a way I couldn't entirely categorize. Not softer, not harder, but something that sat between the two. The tone of a person absorbing information that confirms something they'd hoped wouldn't be confirmed. Then she's operating on a plan that he hasn't agreed to, he said. That was my read, I said. Another silence. This one had weight to it, not the weight of unsaid things, but the weight of said things settling into their proper positions. I stayed for 2 years after I found out, Rafferty said. After the second pregnancy. I want you to know that, because I don't want you to hear what I've told you and think I'm someone who walked away easily or without trying. I stayed because I loved the person I thought she was. And for 2 years, I kept revising what I thought she was to fit the person I still wanted her to be. A pause. That's an expensive thing to do. It cost me the house, most of the savings, a year of my son's life that I can't reconstruct. I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you because I spent those 2 years completely alone with it, and I didn't need to be. Nobody called me. I understood what he was offering. It was not advice, and it was not information, and it was not the kind of thing that requires a response that makes sense of it. It was simply the act of saying I was there once to someone who was somewhere adjacent, so that the geography of the experience had at least one other landmark in it. I sat with it for a long time by myself, he said. I kept thinking if someone had called, if someone on the other side of this had said, "You're not reading this wrong. You're not inventing the shape of it. The thing you're seeing is the thing that's there." I think it would have mattered. He paused once more. "I hope it matters what I've told you." "It does," I said. "I'm not calling to add to what you're carrying," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm calling because I spent 2 years wondering whether the person on the other side of a situation like this felt as alone as I did. I hope you don't. Not tonight." I looked at the Nashville glow through the window. The gas station, the parking lot, the long dark line of Nolensville Pike running south into the city. I said. "Not tonight." We said goodnight. I set the phone face up on the narrow table and looked out the window for a long time after the call ended. 3 people in this city were sitting with the weight of their own choices tonight. Donovan in a house that no longer held his things, with a phone full of calls he shouldn't have made, and a set of promises he'd made to at least 2 people that he'd never intended to keep simultaneously. Blythe, with a plan she'd constructed carefully and completely around a man who didn't yet know the central fact of it, and Rafferty Weston sitting in a parking garage at Vanderbilt after a long shift, calling a woman he'd spoken to twice because he remembered what it felt like to carry something this size in a city that was otherwise asleep. I was the 4th person, and for the first time in the 5 days since I'd found a small black phone behind a sofa cushion with a message on its screen, I was not angry, and I was not afraid, and I was not revising anything. I knew exactly what I was looking at. I turned off the nightstand lamp and lay down on the motel bed in the dark, still in my clothes, and closed my eyes. I did not have trouble sleeping. 2 weeks after Donovan had come home to a house without his belongings in it, I had settled into a rhythm. Motel to office to motel. A life shaped entirely around what I actually wanted, and nothing else. I was reviewing a client file at 10:23 on a Tuesday morning when Marlo appeared in the doorway. "He's at the front desk," she said. She didn't say the name. She didn't need to. "He's asking if you'll see him." Through the glass wall, I could see him back-to-me charcoal suit that had been well pressed at some earlier point in its recent history. Something in the set of his shoulders communicated the specific quality of a person who'd been sleeping badly for 2 weeks. "Send him in," I said. He sat down without being asked, set his hands on his knees, looked at me the way people look at someone when they've rehearsed this moment extensively and just realize the actual version doesn't resemble the rehearsal. "Thank you for seeing me," he said. "You're here," I said. "Go ahead." A moment of quiet, then, "I'm sorry." Not "I'm sorry," but not "I'm sorry you feel that way," just "I'm sorry." 2 words without a trailing clause. I noted the absence and waited. "I don't have an explanation that makes it right," he said. "What I did, the money, the lying, there's no version of it that's defensible. I just wanted to say that to your face, before anything else." I nodded. When someone is moving toward the truth, the best thing you can do is not interrupt the journey. He took a breath. I felt like I was disappearing, in the marriage, in my own life, like I'd become functional hitting marks. Husband, professional, neighbor, repeat. Blythe made me feel like I still mattered to someone in a way that wasn't just about what I was producing. He finished. "You didn't feel invisible, Donovan," I said. He looked at me. "You felt entitled to more than you had without wanting to do the work of deserving it. That's a different thing. You had a person across the breakfast table from you for 14 years who was building something real, a career, a home, a life that required actual effort. You could have said, at any point, 'I feel like I'm disappearing. I need something to change.' You could have said that to me." I kept my voice level. "You chose the version that cost you nothing in the moment and would cost everyone else everything later. That's not invisibility. That's a choice." He was quiet for a long time. "I know," he said, and the way he said it, No defense, no redirect told me this conversation wasn't delivering new information, only delivering it out loud from someone who couldn't be managed or redirected or soothed. "We had 14 good years," he said. "We had 14 years," I said. "I'll let the evidence determine how many of those were good." He stood, straightened his jacket, the small habitual gesture of a man putting himself back into presentable order, and walked to the door. At the threshold, he stopped, didn't turn around. "I am sorry," he said again, "for what it's worth." "I heard you the first time," I said. "That part was real. Hold on to it." He left. Marlo appeared 11 seconds later. I know because I was looking at the clock. "There are 2 men in the lobby," she said. "Suits. One of them is Harwick." 4 floors below, Donovan had stopped on the sidewalk, completely still, briefcase at his side, facing 2 men who had positioned themselves with the practiced stillness of people who are not in a hurry, because the person they're waiting for has nowhere else to go. I watched his hand tighten on the briefcase handle. There are settlements that do not wait for convenient timing. They arrive when the account comes due, and the account always comes due. I watched Donovan straighten his jacket one final time. Then I turned back to the client file, found the line I'd been reading at 10:23 a.m., and continued. There is a particular professional satisfaction, and I use that word carefully because satisfaction is not the same as pleasure, and it is certainly not the same as relief in watching a financial structure come apart along exactly the lines you identified as fault lines. I had spent 15 years in forensic accounting doing precisely that, mapping the architecture of decisions, tracing the load-bearing points, identifying where the weight had been distributed in ways the structure could not sustain. When it came apart, I documented it. That was the job. What happened to Donovan Calloway in the 5 weeks after he walked out of my office building and found Harwick waiting on the sidewalk was not something I sought out or monitored with any particular attention. I learned about it the way I learned about most things that happened outside my immediate line of sight through Marlo, who had the specific talent of a person who processes information efficiently and delivers it without editorial inflation. She would appear in my office doorway in the mornings, coffee in hand, and say what she knew. I would listen, I would note it, and then we would both go back to work. The first thing that happened was the suspension. Harwick's legal team had apparently moved quickly. Within 48 hours of whatever conversation had taken place on the sidewalk outside my building, Donovan had been placed on administrative suspension pending the completion of an internal investigation. The formal letter, Marlo told me, had been delivered to his temporary address, a short-term rental in East Nashville, which explained why he hadn't been back to the Belle Meade property. The investigation itself was not complex. 14 expense reports over 7 months, 47 combined line items, hotel charges at properties with no corresponding project locations, restaurant tabs for 2 at establishments in the Gulch on weekday afternoons when the associated project files showed no client meetings scheduled, 2 spa charges, the kind of charges that show up on a corporate card and require a specific quality of confidence to submit for reimbursement. The confidence of someone who has been doing something long enough to believe it has become invisible. $12,400. It was not a large number by the standards of corporate fraud. I had worked cases involving 8-figure misappropriations, offshore accounts, falsified invoices with more zeros than I cared to remember. $12,000 was in the technical taxonomy of financial crime, a modest figure, but the amount was almost beside the point. What mattered in these situations was not the size of the number, but the clarity of the intent. And the intent here was unambiguous. Marlo told me on a Thursday morning about 10 days after the suspension that Harwick had filed. Davidson County Circuit Court. She said, setting her coffee on the edge of my desk. Misappropriation of company funds, breach of fiduciary duty. His attorney filed the response deadline for 30 days. Did the industry hear about it? I asked. Nashville real estate is not a large community, she said. They heard about it the same week the suspension was announced. There were 2 project partnerships that had been in negotiation, both quietly withdrawn before the lawsuit was even filed. She paused. His name was on a panel at a development conference in October. They removed it from the website. I noted that. The specific texture of professional consequence in a mid-sized city. Not a dramatic public announcement, not a formal statement, just the gradual withdrawal of association. Names removed from websites, invitations that don't arrive, phone calls that go to voicemail and stay there. The second sequence of events I learned about secondhand as well. Though from a less direct source, Marlowe had heard it through a contact at a title company that had worked with both Donovan and Blythe on the development project. Blythe had confronted Donovan directly. I didn't know the specifics of the conversation when it happened what she had said at the beginning before she understood that the plan she'd carried from the beginning of the year to this point was not going to unfold the way she had arranged it. What I knew was the outcome because outcomes in these situations tend to be documented whether or not the conversation itself is. Donovan had denied responsibility. Those were the words Marlowe used, relaying what the contact had relayed, denied responsibility. Not disputed the facts, not asked for time. Denied responsibility in the specific way that signals a person has already decided that no amount of evidence is going to move them toward accountability. Because accountability would require them to sit with something they have decided not to sit with. Blythe Weston, by all available information, was now navigating the situation alone. Her studio on 12th Avenue South in the Gulch had not closed, not yet, but the silence around it was becoming audible in the way that professional silence in a small market gets audible. Referrals dry up before the formal work does. The phone rings less often. The preliminary conversations that used to turn into contracts stop turning into contracts. Marlowe's contact at the title company mentioned that BW Design Consulting, LLC, had not taken on a new client in 6 weeks, and that the LLC itself had come under scrutiny as part of the broader financial investigation, specifically as the receiving entity for the structured transfers from my joint savings account. The Tennessee Secretary of State's office had questions about a single-member LLC that had received $47,000 in 31 structured transfers from a private individual who was now a party to an active civil lawsuit. Those questions do not resolve quickly. On a Tuesday morning, in what would have been the 6th week since Donovan had come home to a house without his belongings, Marlowe set her coffee down on my desk with a particular deliberateness that I had learned over years of working with her. Meant she was about to say something that was specific and verifiable and that she had confirmed before bringing it to me. "You know the white Audi Q5, she said. "I know it," I said. "It was repossessed last Tuesday." She picked up her coffee again. "Missed 2 consecutive payments on the lease. The dealership sent a recovery service." I looked at the file in front of me. A manufacturing company in Brentwood with irregularities in its payroll account, a genuinely interesting case, the kind that required actual attention. "All right," I said. "I want to be precise about what I felt in those weeks, because imprecision would be a disservice to the record." I did not feel satisfaction in the way that satisfaction is sometimes understood, the warm settling of a thing going right, the gratification of an outcome that matches a desired shape. I had not desired this outcome. I had not sat in the motel room on Nolensville Pike mapping out the sequence of consequences and anticipating each one with any particular feeling. What I had done was gather evidence, retain an attorney file paperwork, and let the legal and professional systems function as they were designed to function. The consequences were not mine. They were the natural downstream result of a set of decisions that had been made by people who had at various points calculated that the benefits outweighed the risks and had calculated incorrectly. That calculation error was not my creation. I had simply been the person standing at the output end when the math came due. What I felt, if I'm being accurate, was something closer to recognition. The feeling of seeing a ledger balance correctly. Not happy, not relieved, just level. The columns adding up to what the columns had always been going to add up to once someone looked at them honestly. I spent a lot of those weeks looking out the window of my 4th-floor office in Midtown. The view hadn't changed, the same street, the same roof line across the way. The same particular angle of afternoon light in July that comes in low and warm through the west-facing glass. But I had started to notice things in it that I hadn't paid attention to before. The rhythm of the street below, the way the city moved at its own pace regardless of what was happening 4 floors up. The fact that Nashville, which I had lived in for 11 years and built a career in and arranged an entire life within, was simply continuing, unhurried, indifferent, and completely intact. I had built something real here. That was true before any of this started, and it remained true after. The 14 years were still there. The work was still there. The house in Belle Meade was still in my name, the same name it had been in before the marriage, because I had been the kind of person who documented things carefully, even when she trusted completely. I thought sometimes about that version of myself, the one who had signed those papers 16 years ago, who had known without being asked to think about it that certain things should be kept separate and in order. I had not known then why I knew that. I had simply done it because it was the correct thing to do. I was glad she had. It was on a Wednesday afternoon in the 7th week that Marlo came into the office with her phone in her hand and a look on her face that I recognized as the look of someone who has just received information and is deciding how to deliver it. She set the phone face down on the edge of my desk. "I just heard something," she said, "about Blythe." A pause, not for effect, but the pause of someone selecting their words with actual care. "It might change the way you're seeing some of this." I set down my pen. "Tell me," I said. What Marlo told me that Wednesday afternoon began with a detail I hadn't anticipated, and it was the detail itself, not the outcome, not the consequence, but the specific mechanism of how it started that made me stop completely. Blythe had suggested the paternity test herself. I turned that over in my mind for a moment before I asked Marlo to continue. It was the kind of detail that requires a brief pause, not because it's impossible, but because it reveals something about how a person's mind works under pressure. Blythe had been in a position of acute vulnerability, a pregnancy whose father had denied responsibility, a business under financial investigation, a professional reputation contracting by the week. In that position, most people retreat. They manage. They find the version of the situation that costs least to maintain. Blythe had done the opposite. She had proposed directly a test that would resolve the question of paternity in legal and biological terms. She had done it, Marlo's contact understood, because she was certain. Because she had done the arithmetic of the past several months and arrived at a number she believed was unambiguous. The certainty was the telling part. The result came back 3 weeks after the test was administered at a certified laboratory in Nashville. Marlo had the information secondhand through the same title company contact who had been tracking the professional fallout, but the information itself was unambiguous. Donovan Calloway was not the biological father of Blythe Weston's child. I sat with that for a moment. Not with satisfaction, not with anything that resembled the feeling I might have predicted if you'd asked me 10 months earlier. To imagine the end point of a story that began with a black phone behind a sofa cushion. I sat with it the way you sit with a number that resolves a long-running equation, the feeling of a variable finally assigned of an open account reaching its final line. What the result meant in practical terms was this: Blythe had been certain because she had constructed a version of events in which only one man was possible. The result indicated that version was wrong, which meant there were other possibilities she had either not accounted for or had accounted for and chosen not to examine. Marlo told me with the care of someone relaying information they know carries weight that when Donovan was informed of the result, the confrontation that followed had not been productive for either of them. He had withdrawn completely. No financial support offered, no ongoing communication attempted. The legal obligation was clear. Tennessee family law does not require financial support from a man who is not the biological father, and Donovan had moved within that clarity with the efficiency of someone who had been waiting for a legal exit and had now been handed one. What it meant for Blythe was simpler and considerably harder. She was alone with a child whose father she could not apparently name with the certainty she had believed she possessed. The studio on 12th Avenue South closed in the same month the result came back. The LLC dissolution was filed with the Tennessee Secretary of State's office in a process that, from a regulatory standpoint, closed the loop on the structured transfers and the investigation that had followed them. The apartment in East Nashville was a one-bedroom in a building near 5 Points, according to the same professional network that had been tracking the fallout with the dispassionate attention that small city industries apply to the exits of their own. Donovan left Nashville 6 weeks after the paternity result. Memphis Marlowe had heard. A smaller development firm regional projects, nothing with the scale or profile of what he'd been managing in Nashville. The panel invitation that had been removed from the October conference website had not been reissued. The name that had moved through Nashville real estate for 11 years had gone quiet, in the way that names go quiet when the industry has reached its collective verdict, and the verdict is simply not someone we need to keep track of anymore. I thought about what it cost to arrive at that particular destination. Not the money was documentable finite, a set of numbers I could have reconstructed from memory on a spreadsheet. I thought about the less tangible accounting 11 years of professional credibility in a city where professional credibility is built relationship by relationship and lost in a single news cycle. A marriage that had required 2 people to build and only one to dismantle. A house that had been until a Monday morning in July the place where someone had lived their actual life. She burned down 2 marriages, I said, and I was speaking as much to myself as to Marlowe, who was sitting quietly on the other side of my desk, with her coffee going cold in her hands. Hers and mine, for a man who left her exactly the way she left everyone else. Marlowe didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say to that. It was an observation, not a complaint, the kind of thing you say out loud, not because you need a response, but because saying it settles the shape of it into something you can actually look at clearly. I was still at my desk 2 hours later when my phone rang. The same number I had saved 4 months ago as R. Weston with no other notation. I answered on the second ring. I heard, Rafferty said. He didn't say what he'd heard or how. He didn't need to. I know, I said. A brief pause, the particular silence of 2 people who have already established over several very specific conversations that they don't need to fill space with words to communicate adequately. I want to ask you something, he said, and I want you to be honest. Go ahead. Does it make me a terrible person? He said that my first reaction was relief. I looked at the window. The Nashville skyline in the late afternoon, the roof lines I'd been looking at for 11 years, from this same angle, in the same building. The sky doing what Tennessee skies do in early fall, a clear, pale blue that makes everything look a little sharper than it actually is. No, I said. It makes you human. Another pause. Are you all right? I considered the question honestly, which is the only way worth considering it. Yes, I said. I think I actually am. Good. And then, after a moment, I have a shift tomorrow night, but I'm off Sunday. There's a place I've been meaning to try on the east side, if you wanted company for coffee. I had not planned for that sentence. I had not been in any conscious sense waiting for it. But when it arrived, I recognized it as the kind of simple thing that is in the right moment. Exactly what it needs to be. Sunday works, I said. Justice. I have learned rarely arrives in the shape you imagined it when you first understood you needed it. It does not come with a particular sound or a specific moment of resolution. No gavel. No final statement, no scene that the camera holds on for a beat too long to make sure the audience understands what they've witnessed. It comes the way most true things come quietly, along the lines of its own logic in its own time. But it comes. 10 months after a Monday morning in July that had begun with a secondhand sofa cushion and ended with a ledger I couldn't stop reading. I drove across Nashville to a coffee shop I'd been to once before, at a corner table near a window that looked out onto a street I'd been living parallel to for 11 years, without ever quite noticing. Rafferty was already there. He was sitting at the corner table with 2 cups in front of him, looking at his phone with the focused expression of someone trying to remember the exact details of something they'd read earlier. And when he looked up and saw me come through the door, he set the phone down without finishing the thought. There were 2 cups. He had not asked whether I wanted anything particular. He had simply brought two. I thought as I crossed the room toward the corner table that there is something to be said for a person who shows up having already handled the small things. 10 months is enough time for a city to look genuinely different, not the skyline that changes too slowly to notice. What changes is the angle from which you approach it, the specific emotional register you carry to streets you've driven 1,000 times before. Nashville in late April is a particular kind of beautiful. The dogwood trees along Belle Meade Boulevard were in full bloom, and I had driven to Bongo, Java with the windows down, warm air. Green smell, a Tennessee spring that had finally committed. The city looked like itself, but cleaner, the way things look after something difficult has passed, and left the air clearer than it found it. Rafferty was already at the corner table. 2 coffees in front of him, a large black for himself, a medium with room for me because I had mentioned it once months ago, and he had noted it the way he noted most things quietly and then acted on it. "Senior partner," he said. "Since February," I said. "How did you hear?" "Marlowe posted something on LinkedIn." He smiled, not performed, just the natural expression of someone who had found something worth smiling about. "It suits you." The morning moved the way good conversations move, without urgency, without gaps that needed filling. He told me his son had turned 10, that the custody arrangement had shifted to 4 days a week after the boy himself had asked for it in mediation. He said it the way you say something you hadn't let yourself hope for until it happened. "Good," I said, and I meant it. At some point, the conversation moved to where it was always going to move. "The Harwick lawsuit hasn't settled," Rafferty said. "Those things take time when the other party is minimizing damages. Either way, it follows him. That's how it works in a professional context." We had both, I thought, arrived at the same place regarding Donovan Calloway not wishing it worse, not engineering a more comfortable outcome. The process was doing what it was designed to do. "Blythe," I said, "still in East Nashville. Freelance drafting residential small projects. The baby was born in March. A girl. Healthy." He looked at his cup. "She looks like someone who stopped running and started figuring out what she has." I thought about that. About a person who has spent years operating from strategy, who runs out of the conditions that made it possible and finds only what's actually there. Not comfortable, but possibly more honest. "I hope she figures it out," I said. And I found somewhat to my own surprise that I meant it. "Do you ever think about what would have happened?" Rafferty said. "If you hadn't looked at the account statement." I was quiet for a moment. "Every day," I said, "and then I order another coffee." He laughed, a real one. It was the first time in the entire arc of everything that had happened that I had made someone laugh like that in a conversation related to any of this. It felt unexpectedly very good. What Rafferty and I had was not something that fit a category. Not ordinary friendship, though it had that texture. Not romance, though it carried the warmth of 2 people who genuinely liked each other. More specific than either. We'd both been in the middle of something with no good maps. We had both found our way out by different routes that turned out to run parallel, rebuilt ourselves separately into versions we could live with. That is rarer than romance. Romance requires chemistry. What we had required something harder. The willingness to look at the worst thing that happened to you and refuse to let it be the last thing that defined you. "You know what's strange?" he said. "I don't hate any of them anymore." "Neither do I said. "Anger is expensive. I'd rather spend the energy somewhere else. On work I care about. On mornings that belong to me. On whatever comes next, which I don't have a name for yet, and I'm finding I don't mind that." He looked at me the way he had on our first phone call, someone who has heard something true and isn't going to argue with it. That, he said, sounds about right. That evening, I drove home the long way down Belle Meade Boulevard, windows down dogwood petals drifting across the road, radio off. I needed the quiet. I had something I needed to finish. They teach you in accounting that every balance sheet tells a story. Assets on one side, liabilities on the other. What you have, what you owe, what remains when you carry the number forward. I had been reading balance sheets for 15 years. Numbers don't lie. They record. That is a different thing. and the difference matters. I turned off the engine and sat in the driveway for a moment before going inside. The house was quiet in the way that houses are quiet when they belong entirely to you. Not the silence of absence, not the loaded silence of something unsaid still occupying space, but the clean silence of a place that fits its occupant. I had repainted in February, warm ivory instead of the gray we'd chosen together. Every time I came home to it, I noticed the difference and was glad. I walked through the kitchen first. I always did now, not because I needed anything from it, but because it was where everything had started, and I had decided not to root around it. I stood at the table for a moment. 14 months ago, I had stood in this kitchen on a Monday morning making coffee while my husband announced a trip to a city he was not going to. With a phone, he kept face down on the table throughout breakfast. I had handed him his coffee. I had kissed him goodbye and watched his car move down the driveway without thinking anything in particular. The woman who stood here that morning had trusted completely. That was not a flaw. That was the appropriate response to 14 years of evidence that had been carefully managed. What she hadn't known was that her skills, the exact skills she applied every day to other people's financial irregularities, were waiting patiently in her hands, ready to be turned toward the truth of her own life. The garden was visible through the kitchen window. The peonies Donovan had called a waste of time to plant were in their second week of bloom, wide, full heads, in cream and pale pink. I had planted them in October, in the first cool weeks after the divorce was finalized, when I needed something to do with my hands that wasn't reviewing documents. They had come up exactly as promised. They always do if you give them the right conditions and don't disturb them before they're ready. I opened my laptop at the study desk positioned to face the window, now an obvious improvement I couldn't account for never making before. A new project file. A corporate restructuring case out of Brentwood. The first case that was entirely mine to lead. Not investigating anything. There was nothing left to investigate. I had loved him. I want to be accurate about that, not because it changes the accounting, but because imprecision would be a disservice to the truth of it. The 14 years had contained real things. The love was real. The man I thought I was loving was not. Once you find that line, you can work with what's true. A clean ledger. Not blank, a clean ledger is never blank. It carries forward the accurate record of what happened, what it cost, what remained. What it offers is not erasure. It offers a line drawn under the previous period and a new column beginning and space to fill it with whatever comes next. Somewhere in Nashville, Donovan was rebuilding from the wreckage of his own choices. Somewhere in East Nashville, Blythe was learning to face consequences without a strategy for avoiding them. And I was here with a case file open, and a garden in bloom and 15 years of skill in my hands, and a clear, uncomplicated sense of who I was and what I was for. That was what neither of them had planned for me. Not bitterness, not damage, not a woman diminished by what had been done to her. Freedom. Not the freedom of someone who escaped, but the freedom of someone who looked at the full picture, understood every line of it, and chose herself anyway. I turned off the desk lamp. The garden was still there in the dark, blooming without an audience exactly as it was supposed to. That is my story. Not a family drama story I would have chosen for myself, but one I lived, documented, and survived. If there is a lesson in it, I suppose it is, this trust is not a flaw. It is what makes a life worth building. What you owe yourself is the clarity to recognize when the evidence no longer supports the trust and the courage to act on what the numbers actually say. I am sometimes asked whether I am bitter. The honest answer is no. Bitterness is a long-term liability with no return. I watched two people burn through every asset they had, professional, financial. Personal, because they believed the accounting would never catch up with them. It always does. I did not make that happen. I simply stayed out of the way and let it. If I could say one thing to anyone standing where I once stood in a kitchen that felt like home-handing coffee to someone who had already decided to leave without telling you, it would be this. Do not wait for certainty before you start asking questions. The questions are not a betrayal. The silence is. God has a way of placing the right information in the right hands at the right time. I found a phone behind a sofa cushion. I knew what to do with what I found. That was not an accident. I do not regret a single step of it. That is my personal opinion, and I am at peace with it. If this family revenge story stayed with you, if you recognize something in Serena's choices or Donovan's or Blythe's, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. These family drama stories exist because real people navigate them every day, and sometimes it helps to hear that someone else found their way through. If you know someone who needs this particular family drama story right now, share it with them quietly. And if you want to follow along for the next one, the subscribe button is right there. And I would genuinely be glad to have you. Thank you for staying until the end. It means more than you know. A note before you go, the stories ahead contain fictionalized elements constructed for the purpose of exploring real human experiences. They are not documentaries, they are mirrors. If that's not what you're looking for today, no judgment at all. Choose what serves you. But if you're staying, the next family revenge story is already waiting, and I think you'll want to hear it. These family revenge stories are built to make you think. I hope this one did.
Alright, that's the story for today. Thanks for sticking around. I will see you in the next one.